The inner office smelled of beeswax and old money, but across the mahogany desk, the scent of desperation was suffocating. My parents sat there in tailored wool suits that I knew hadn't been paid for smiling like vultures at a feast. "I'm Lillian Walsh," as they dabbed at dry eyes with silk handkerchiefs pretending to mourn a mother they hadn't visited in years. I couldn't help but remember the cold rain against Grandma's sunroom glass, the sound of her waiting for a son who never came. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The grandfather clock chimed, marking the moment their house of cards was about to fall. Tick, tock, tick, tock. They say silence is golden, but in my experience, silence is expensive. It costs you your pride, your patience, and sometimes your family. I sat there listening to the grandfather clock in the corner of the waiting room. It was a massive, ancient thing counting away the seconds of a life that had already ended. I shifted in my chair. The fabric of my dress was scratching the back of my neck. It was a cheap polyester blend I'd picked up off a clearance rack for $20. It was black, respectful, and entirely uncomfortable. I tried to smooth the wrinkles over my knees acutely, aware of how I looked compared to the two people sitting across from me. My parents, Robert and Sylvia Walsh. If you walked past them on the street, you would think they were royalty. My father was wearing a charcoal wool suit that was tailored to within an inch of its life. His shoes were Italian leather polished to a mirror shine. My mother sat next to him, upright and rigid. She wore a vintage Chanel suit, a string of pearls, and enough hairspray to withstand a hurricane. They looked perfect. They looked like the picture of success. But I'm a social worker. I spend my days looking at broken families, and I know exactly what to look for. I know that poverty isn't just dirty clothes and empty cupboards. Sometimes, poverty is a frantic, wide-eyed look masked by expensive mascara. I could smell it on them. Beneath my mother's heavy floral perfume, there was the sharp metallic scent of desperation. I watched my father's hand as it rested on his knee. It was trembling, just a little, a subtle vibration that traveled up his arm. They were drowning. Everyone in town knew it, even if they pretended not to. The country club membership had lapsed months ago. The rumors about the second mortgage were circulating at the grocery store. They were here for one reason, and one reason only. They were waiting for the lifeboat. Grandma Elise was the lifeboat. Or rather, her money was. I looked away from them, focusing back on the clock. I didn't want them to catch me staring. If they did, they might start talking to me, and I didn't have the energy for their particular brand of conversation today. To them, I wasn't really Lillian, their daughter. I was an audience. I was a witness to the injustice they felt they had suffered by simply having to wait for an inheritance. I closed my eyes, letting the rhythmic ticking of the clock fade away. Suddenly, the smell of furniture polish and stale waiting room coffee vanished. In my mind, I was back there. I was back in the sunroom. It was raining that day. I remember the sound of it, a relentless, heavy drumming against the glass roof of the conservatory. It was cold, a bitter November chill that seeped through the window panes, but inside, it was warm. It smelled of dried lavender and old paper. Grandma Elise sat in her high-backed wicker chair. She looked so small then. The cancer had whittled her down, stripping away the soft curves I remembered from my childhood, leaving behind sharp angles and fragile bones. But her eyes were the same, clear blue and terrifyingly sharp. She reached out and picked up her teacup. Her hand shook violently. The china clattered against the saucer, clink, 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 a sound that echoed in the quiet room. I reached out to steady her hand. Her skin felt like parchment paper, dry and thin. "Here, Grandma," I said softly. "Let me help." She took a sip, wincing as she swallowed. Then she set the cup down and looked at the empty chair across from us. It was the same chair that had been empty every Sunday for 5 years. "Did he call Lillian?" she asked. Her voice was raspy, barely a whisper. I felt a knot form in my stomach. It was the same knot I felt every week, the ritual of the lie. I forced a smile. I made sure my voice was bright and steady. "He wanted to, Grandma. He really did. But you know how the market is right now. He's closing a massive deal. He's at the office buried in paperwork. He told me to give you his love." It was a lie. I knew it. She knew it. My father wasn't at the office. He was likely on the golf course or sitting in his study drinking scotch. He couldn't afford complaining about how long the old woman was taking to let go. Grandma Elise looked at me. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared, her blue eyes watering slightly. She wasn't crying because she was dying. She was crying because her son couldn't be bothered to say goodbye. "He's a busy man," she said finally. The bitterness in her voice was so subtle you would miss it if you weren't listening closely. "Aunt Sylvia, is she busy too?" "Social committee," I lied again. "They're planning the winter gala." "Ah," Grandma whispered. "Important work." She turned her head to look out at the rain. "You're a good girl, Lillian. You're a terrible liar, but you're a good girl." I squeezed her hand. "I'm not lying, Grandma." "Hush," she said, patted my hand. "It doesn't matter. You're here. That's what matters. You're here, and the tea is hot." We sat in silence for the rest of the afternoon, watching the rain wash the world gray. I remember thinking that the silence in that room was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things we were too polite to say. It was filled with her heartbreak and my shame for covering for them. Click. The sound of a heavy latch lifting snapped me back to the present. My eyes flew open. The memory of the lavender and the rain evaporated, replaced instantly by the sterile air of the lawyer's office. The massive oak door to the inner office swung open. Mr. Thorne stood in the doorway. He was exactly as I remembered him from the funeral, a man carved out of granite. He was tall, thin, and wore a suit that looked like it was from another century. His reading glasses hung on a gold chain around his neck, and his expression was grim. He didn't look like a man about to distribute a fortune. He looked like a judge about to pass a sentence. He held a file in his hand. He looked at us over the rim of his glasses. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh," he said. His voice was like gravel. "Lillian, please come in." I started to gather my purse, moving to stand up. But I wasn't fast enough. My parents were already moving. It was instant. The second the invitation was given, the veneer of polite grief vanished. They shot out of their chairs with an energy I hadn't seen in years. My father brushed past me, his shoulder hitting mine hard enough to make me stumble back a step. He didn't even look at me. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He didn't offer a hand to help me up. Finally, I heard my mother hiss under her breath as she hurried after him. "It's about time." They rushed toward the door, their eyes fixed on the mahogany desk inside the inner office. They looked like starving wolves who had just smelled blood. I stood there for a moment, steadying myself against the wall. I watched them walk through the door, heads held high, already counting money that wasn't in their hands yet. They treated me like an accessory they had brought along, for appearances, something to be discarded as soon as they got what they wanted. I took a deep breath, smoothed my cheap dress, and followed them into the lion's den. We all have moments where we see our family clearly for the first time, not as who we want them to be, but who they really are. It's a painful thing, isn't it? Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The inner office of Mr. Thorne was a mausoleum of wealth. That's the only way to describe it. It didn't smell like an office. It smelled like beeswax, pipe tobacco, and very old money. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with dark mahogany bookshelves packed tight with legal texts that looked like they hadn't been touched since the Eisenhower administration. In the center of the room sat a desk the size of a small car, its surface polished to a deep reflective shine. Mr. Thorne walked behind the desk and took his seat. He moved with a slow, deliberate gravity like a judge settling in for a murder trial. I took the chair in the corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. My parents, however, did the opposite. They expanded. My father, Robert, unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned back, crossing his legs. He looked around the room with a critical, appraising eye. He wasn't looking at the architecture, he was looking at the price tags. "Mahogany," he said, tapping the arm of his chair. He looked at my mother. "Solid mahogany, Sylvia. You don't see this anymore. Everything is particle board these days." My mother nodded, adjusting the silk scarf at her neck. She looked pale, but her eyes were feverish. "It's very distinguished, Robert." "It's outdated," he corrected, keeping his voice just loud enough to be heard, but soft enough to claim plausible deniability. "First thing we do when we liquidate the estate is get an appraiser in here. I bet this desk alone would fetch 10,000 at auction, maybe 12. I felt my stomach turn. We hadn't even heard the will yet, and he was already selling the furniture. "Robert," I whispered, leaning forward. "Please." He glanced at me over his shoulder, his eyes cold. "Please what, Lillian?" "It's business. Grandma Elise is gone. We have to be practical. There are obligations." Obligations. That was his favorite word for debts he had accrued to maintain an image he couldn't afford. I knew the numbers. I was a social worker. I knew how to look up public records. I knew about the $12,000 in back taxes on their estate. I knew about the lien the IRS had placed on the property 3 months ago. I knew that my mother's credit cards were maxed out to the limit, probably paying for the very shoes she was wearing right now. They weren't just greedy. They were terrified. They were standing on a trapdoor, and Grandma Elise's money was the only latch keeping it closed. "I was thinking," my mother whispered to him, ignoring me completely. "After we settle the immediate accounts, the Amalfi Coast, just for 2 weeks. We need to recover, Robert. The stress of Mother's illness, it's been so taxing on us." I almost laughed. Taxing. They hadn't visited her in 6 months. The only thing taxing them was the effort of pretending to care at the funeral. "Amalfi sounds appropriate," Robert agreed, nodding solemnly. "We'll book first class. I can't have you cramping up in coach, not in your condition." Her condition being, of course, a complete intolerance for discomfort. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat. It wasn't a loud sound, but it cut through the room like a gunshot. He picked up a stack of papers. He tapped them against the desk. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound was sharp and rhythmic. He didn't look up. He just straightened the edges of the document, taking his time. He was letting them sweat. He was letting the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. My father shifted in his chair. The leather groaned beneath him. He checked his gold watch, a watch I knew he had tried to pawn last year and then bought back when a loan came through. "Well," Robert said, his voice booming slightly too loud for the small room. "Mr. Thorne, We're all here. Shall we proceed? I'm sure you're a busy man and we have arrangements to attend to. Thorne looked up. His eyes were gray and unreadable. He placed his hand flat on the document. The last will and testament of Elise Margaret Walsh, Thorne said. His voice was dry like leaves scraping against a sidewalk. I shall begin with the preamble. Is that necessary? Robert interrupted. He flashed a tight, charming smile, the smile he used on bankers when he was asking for an extension. We all knew Mother well. She was a woman of faith, a pillar of the community, etc., etc. Can we skip to the distribution of assets? I believe the law requires efficiency. The law, Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave, requires that I fulfill the wishes of the deceased. And her wish was that this be read, in full. Robert's smile faltered, then vanished. He sat back, crossing his arms. Fine, get on with it. Thorne adjusted his glasses. He began to read. I, Elise Margaret Walsh, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this document to be my last will and testament. I leave this life with a heart full of memories and a soul prepared for judgment. Thorne paused. He looked at my parents. Then he looked at me. For a second, his expression softened just a fraction before hardening again. I have watched the world change, Thorne read. I have watched my family grow. And in my final years, I have learned that the truest currency in this life is not silver or gold, but time. The time we give to one another. The time we sacrifice. My mother let out a loud, impatient sigh. She checked her manicure. Robert, she whispered, hissing, we are going to lose our reservation at Le Jardin if this drags on. I know, Sylvia, he snapped quietly. I couldn't take it anymore. Let him speak, I said. My voice shook a little, but I forced it to be steady. She wrote this. Those are her words. The least you can do is listen to them. My father turned on me. The charm was completely gone now. His face was twisted in a look of pure, unadulterated annoyance. Quiet, Lillian, he said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. You're here out of courtesy. Don't push it. The adults are talking business. It's not business, I said, gripping the arms of my chair. It's Grandma. It's a transaction, he countered. She's dead, Lillian. The poetry doesn't help her now. The money helps us. Mr. Walsh, Thorne said. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it stopped my father mid-sentence. If you interrupt one more time, I will suspend this reading, and we can resume it next month. Do I make myself clear? Next month. The color drained from my father's face. He couldn't wait a month. He probably couldn't wait a week. The creditors were circling. Apologies, Robert muttered, staring at his shoes. Please, continue. Thorne held the stare for a moment longer, asserting his dominance before looking back down at the papers. Article 1, Specific Bequests. My parents leaned forward. This was it. The appetizers before the main course. To the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, I leave my collection of antique silver. My mother flinched. The silver, she whispered. That service was worth $5,000. Why would a hospital want spoons? To Mrs. Higgins, my neighbor of 20 years. Thorne continued, ignoring her. I leave my collection of porcelain dolls and the oak display cabinet. My father rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. Great. The dolls. I was going to sell those to that antique shop on 4th Street. That's another $500 down the drain. To the Rivertown Public Library. Thorne read, I leave my personal library of first editions. The books, Robert said, slapping his knee. I told you, Sylvia. She gave away the books. She's literally giving away the furniture I was planning to sell." "Robert, hush," Sylvia said, though she looked just as annoyed. "It's just knickknacks. Let her give the junk to the peasants. We're here for the accounts, the portfolio." I sat there feeling a hot flush of shame creeping up my neck. They were parsing out her life like vultures picking at a carcass. They didn't care that Mrs. Higgins had checked on Grandma every day when the nurse was off. They didn't care that Grandma loved those books more than she loved any jewelry she owned. They only saw lost profit. Thorne turned the page. The paper made a crisp, loud sound in the quiet room. "Article 2, he announced. "The primary estate." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a hungry, predatory focus. My father sat up straighter, buttoning his jacket as if preparing to receive an award. My mother smoothed her skirt, a small, greedy smile playing on her lips. This was the moment, the big pot, the $5 million that would wipe away the debt, the tax liens, the shame, the money that would let them pretend for another few years that they were better than everyone else. Thorne looked at them. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was about to drop a guillotine blade and wasn't entirely sure he wanted to watch it fall. "The remainder of the estate," Thorne said, "includes the primary residence at 44 Elm Street, the investment portfolio, and all liquid cash assets held in the First National Trust." "Yes," Robert breathed. "Yes, go on." "The total value of these assets," Thorne said, "is estimated at approximately $5.2 million. My mother gasped. She actually reached out and grabbed my father's hand. $5 million. It was more than they thought. It was salvation. Thorne put his glasses back on. He looked down at the paper. "I hereby direct the disposition of these assets as follows." The room went silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the outer room, muffled now but still there. Tick, tock, tick, tock. My parents held their breath. I looked at the floor, wishing I was anywhere else. We often think we know the people who raised us. We think we know their limits. But greed has a way of erasing limits. It turns people into strangers. And in that office, I realized I was sitting in a room with two strangers who would sell my dignity for a second chance at a high society life. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Mr. Thorne adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the document, his finger tracing the line of text. My parents were leaning so far forward in their chairs they were almost falling out of them. My mother was gripping her purse like a lifeline. My father was practically vibrating. "To my son, Robert," Thorne read his voice, devoid of any emotion, "and his wife, Sylvia." Robert smiled. It was a reflex, a muscle memory of victory. He extended his hand slightly, palm up, as if the check were going to materialize out of thin air and float into his grasp. Thorne paused. He looked up, locking eyes with my father. "I leave the sum of $0.00." For a second, nobody moved. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Then the sound of leather tearing. Screech! My father's chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as he shot to his feet. "Excuse me," Robert's voice cracked. It wasn't a roar. It was a high-pitched sound of disbelief. "Read that again." "It is quite clear, Mr. Walsh," Thorne said, not moving a muscle. $0.00. "That's a mistake," my father stammered. He looked around the room, frantic. "That's a clerical error. You're reading a draft. Where is the final version? Where is the real will?" "This is the final version," Thorne said. "Signed, witnessed, and notarized 3 weeks before her passing." "She was out of her mind," my mother shrieked. She stood up too, her face blotchy and red. She was on medication. She didn't know what she was doing. She knew exactly what she was doing, Thorne said. This is illegal. Robert slammed his hand on the mahogany desk. Bang! You can't disinherit your own children. It's against the laws of nature. We are her blood. We are her only family. You were her relatives, Thorne corrected, his voice ice cold. You ceased to be her family a long time ago. I'll sue, Robert shouted. Spittle flew from his mouth. I'll tie this estate up in probate for years. I'll burn the whole thing down before I let it go to who did she give it to? The cat shelter? The library? He spun around looking at me but looking through me. He didn't think for a second I was a player in this game. I sat there frozen. My hands were folded in my lap. I felt a strange sensation washing over me. It wasn't anger, it was relief. She did it. Grandma Elise actually did it. She didn't give them the money. She knew. She knew that if she gave them $5 million, they would be dead in a year from excess, or they would just continue to be the same hollow, cruel people they had always been. I smiled. I couldn't help it. I thought the money had gone to charity. I thought about the animal shelter getting a new wing or the library getting a roof repair. It felt like justice. It doesn't matter who it went to, Robert snarled, turning back to Thorne, because I am contesting it. Today, right now. Get me the phone. Sit down, Mr. Walsh, Thorne's voice boomed. It filled the small office, rattling the windows. Sit down, or I will have security remove you from this building, and you will hear the rest of this from the sidewalk. My father blinked. He looked at the door, then back at the desk. Slowly, reluctantly, he sank back into his chair. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. My mother was weeping softly, muttering about the bank, the house, the shame. Thorne waited until the silence returned. He smoothed the paper again. He turned his head. He looked directly at me. To my granddaughter, Lillian, he read. My head snapped up. Whom I trust to know the value of $1 because she has earned everyone she has ever held. Thorne paused. He took a breath. I have established a generation-skipping trust, he said. The entirety of my estate, including the investment portfolio, the cash reserves, and the commercial building on 4th Street currently valued at $4.5 million, are to be transferred immediately to Lillian Walsh. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was a vacuum. It sucked the air out of the room. I couldn't breathe. $5 million, the building I owned. Everything. No, my mother whispered. She looked at me, horror dawning on her face. Lillian, she manipulated her. Robert shouted, jumping up again. I knew it. You snake, you little snake. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You went over there every Sunday, didn't you? You sat there and you whispered poison in her ear. You told her we hated her. You told her lies to steal our birthright. I didn't. I started, my voice small. You coerced a dying woman, Robert screamed. He was leaning over me now, his face inches from mine. That is fraud, Lillian. That is elder abuse. I will have you thrown in jail. I will have your license revoked. She was senile, Sylvia wailed. She didn't know who was in the room. Lillian probably handed her a paper and told her it was a birthday card. That is enough, Thorne shouted. It is not enough, Robert yelled back. I want proof. I want proof that my mother was of sound mind. I want proof that she knew we weren't there, because we were there, we visited, we called. Lillian is a liar. Click. The side door to the office opened. It was a quiet sound, but it stopped my father mid-sentence. A woman stepped into the room. She was wearing a simple blue cardigan and sensible shoes. She had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she was holding a thick black logbook against her chest. It was Mrs. Gable, Grandma's night nurse. I hadn't seen her since the funeral. She looked at me and gave a small, sad smile. Then she turned to my parents. Her expression hardened into stone. "Mrs. Gable," my mother said, her voice trembling, you can tell them. Tell them how confused Mother was. Tell them how we called." Mrs. Gable didn't say a word. She walked to the desk and placed the black book down in front of Mr. Thorne. "This is the visitation log," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was soft, but it carried a steel weight. "I kept it for 3 years, every visitor, every phone call, every delivery. It was my job to document Mrs. Walsh's stress levels." She opened the book. The pages crinkled. "January," she read. "Lillian Walsh, 4 visits, duration 4 hours each, activities reading tea conversation." She looked up at my father. "Robert Walsh, 0 visits, 0 phone calls." "I was traveling," Robert lied. "I was in Europe, February." Mrs. Gable continued, ignoring him. "Lillian Walsh, 4 visits. She brought soup." She brushed Mrs. Walsh's hair. She paused. "Robert Walsh, 1 phone call. Duration 3 minutes." She looked down at the page. Notes. Subject: Robert asked for a loan of $50,000. Mrs. Walsh declined. Subject: Robert hung up. Mrs. Walsh cried for 2 hours. The room went deadly silent. My father's face turned a color I had never seen before, a mix of purple and gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "She wasn't senile, Mr. Walsh," Mrs. Gable said, closing the book with a heavy thud. "She was heartbroken. She waited for you. Every single day she looked at that door. And every single day the only person who walked through it was Lillian." Mrs. Gable turned to me. "She died of a lot of things, honey. But mostly she died knowing exactly who loved her and who didn't." My mother sank back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. It wasn't a gesture of sorrow. It was a gesture of hiding. She couldn't look at Mrs. Gable. She couldn't look at me. But my father, he didn't look ashamed. He looked furious. He looked like a man who had been cheated at cards, not a man who had neglected his mother. He stared at the logbook as if he wanted to set it on fire. "This is a setup," he hissed. "You're all in on it. The nurse, the lawyer, the daughter. You conspired to steal my money." "It's not your money, Robert," Mr. Thorne said quietly. "It never was. It was hers. And now," he pushed the file across the desk toward me, "it is Lillian's." I looked at the file. It was thick. It was heavy. Inside that folder was the power to change everything. It was the power to pay off my student loans, the power to buy a house, the power to never worry about a heating bill again. But more than that, it was a gavel banging down. It was a judgment. My parents sat there stripped of their lies, stripped of their future, and stripped of their dignity. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the urge to fix it for them. I didn't feel the urge to lie and say, "It's okay, we'll work it out." I looked at my father. "You didn't visit," I said. "I was busy," he snapped. "You weren't busy," I said. "You were waiting," he flinched. "You were waiting for her to die," I said. "And she knew it." The truth is a funny thing. We spend so much time running from it, but when it finally catches us, it doesn't just hurt. It liberates. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The silence that followed Mrs. Gable's words wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a car crash, Before the sirens start wailing, a moment of total suspended shock. My father, Robert, stared at the logbook on the desk as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. His face had lost that purple rage-filled hue. Now it was a pale, sickly gray. The fight had gone out of him. The bluster, the shouting, the threats of lawsuits, it all evaporated the moment the truth was read aloud. He knew, and I knew, that there was no judge in this country who would overturn this will. He slumped back in his chair. The leather creaked a long, mournful sound in the quiet room. Then the weeping started. It began as a sniffle, then a sob, then a full-blown wail. My mother, Sylvia, buried her face in her hands. "Oh my God," she moaned. "Oh my God, we're ruined." It was a performance. I had seen it 1,000 times before. It was the same cry she used when a waiter brought her the wrong wine, or when a dress she wanted was out of stock. But this time, there was a jagged edge of real terror underneath the theatrics. She pulled a handkerchief from her purse silk naturally and dabbed at eyes that were surprisingly dry. Then she turned to me. Her entire demeanor shifted. The imperious cold woman who had walked in here treating me like a coat rack was gone. In her place was a fragile, wounded bird. "Lily," she whispered. She reached across the gap between our chairs, her hand trembling. "Lily, baby." I didn't take her hand. I just watched it hover in the air, her manicured nails catching the light. "You have to understand," she said, her voice trembling with a desperate, cloying sweetness. "We didn't stay away because we didn't care. We stayed away for you." I blinked. "For me?" "Yes," she nodded vigorously. "We wanted you to have that time with her. We knew how special your bond was. We stepped back so you could step forward. We sacrificed our time with her so you could be the favorite." It was a lie so bold, so breathtakingly delusional that I almost admired it. She was rewriting history in real time. "Is that right?" I asked, my voice flat. "Of course it is," she said, gaining confidence. "And look, it worked. She left you everything. We're so proud of you, honey. So, so proud." She looked at my father. "Aren't we, Robert?" Robert seemed to wake up from a trance. He sat up straight, buttoning his jacket again, trying to reassemble the scattered pieces of his dignity. "Yes," he said, clearing his throat. "Yes, well, it's a significant responsibility, Lillian. A very significant responsibility." He leaned forward, putting on his business face. It was the face of a man who was used to being in charge, even though he had run every business he ever touched into the ground. "Now," he said, clasping his hands together, "we need to be practical. $5 million it's a lot of money. It's a dangerous amount of money for a young woman in your position." He looked at me with a pitying smile. "You're a social worker, Lillian. You're used to buying groceries on a budget, dealing with paperwork. You don't know the first thing about capital gains tax or portfolio diversification or asset management." "And you do?" I asked. He bristled. "I have experience. I know how the world works. Look, here is the plan." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a silver pen. He held it out to me like he was offering me a lifeline. "Mr. Thorne can draw up a limited power of attorney," Robert said, speaking quickly now. "You sign the administration rights over to me. I will handle the headaches. I'll deal with the taxes, the sale of the building, the investments. I'll set you up with a nice monthly allowance. Generous, of course. Maybe 5,000 a month. You could quit your job. You could travel." He was smiling, but his eyes were dead. He wasn't offering to help me. He was trying to hijack the ship before it left the harbor. "And the rest?" I asked. "What happens to the rest of the money?" I'll invest it, he said quickly. For the family, for the future, for the debts, I corrected. The smile vanished. The bank called the house yesterday, didn't they? I asked. My mother let out a sharp gasp. Robert froze. I don't know what you're talking about, he muttered. I saw the notice, Dad, I said. I checked the foreclosure listings for my clients. I saw 44 Elm Street on the list. You're not just broke, you're drowning. The air went out of him. He looked small. He looked old. Lillian, he whispered, they're going to take the house next Tuesday. If we don't come up with $200,000, they lock the doors. And the club, I asked. Cancelled? He admitted, his voice barely audible. The cars are leased, the cards are maxed, we have nothing. My mother started crying again, and this time it was real. I can't be homeless, Lillian, I can't. What will people say? The shame of it. It will kill me. So, Robert said, his voice taking on a begging, whining tone that was more pathetic than his anger had been. You see, you have to help us. You have to sign. We're your parents. We gave you life. You owe us this. You owe us, that phrase. It hung in the air between us. For 28 years I had felt that debt. I felt I owed them for my education, for my clothes, for the roof over my head. I had spent my life trying to pay it back by being quiet, by being good, by covering for their lies. But as I looked at them, my father with his trembling hands and my mother with her running mascara, I realized the ledger was balanced. They had given me life, yes, but Grandma Elise had given me a future. I stood up. The sound of my chair sliding back was loud in the quiet room. I turned to Mr. Thorne. He had been watching the entire exchange silently, his face an impassive mask. Mr. Thorne, I said. Yes, Miss Walsh. Is the trust secure? Is the will contestable? Thorne shook his head. It is ironclad, Lillian. I wrote it myself. And with Mrs. Gable's testimony and the visitation logs, no judge will touch it. The money is yours. The building is yours. The decision is yours. Can they access any of it without my signature? Not a penny, Thorne said. I nodded. I felt a lightness in my chest, a physical sensation of a weight being lifted. I turned back to my parents. Robert was holding the pen out, his hand, shaking. Lillian, just sign. We can fix this. We can be a family again. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at him. No. The word was simple. It didn't need to be shouted. It landed on the desk like a stone. What? Robert whispered. No, I said again. I'm not signing anything. I'm not giving you control, and I am not giving you the money. You ungrateful little... My mother started to screech, leaping up. Sit down, Sylvia, I said. My voice was calm, authoritative. It was the voice I used on angry clients. I am leaving now. I picked up my purse. I smoothed my cheap polyester dress. Lillian? My father shouted, panic rising in his voice. You can't do this. You can't leave us here. We have nothing. We'll be on the street. I walked to the heavy oak door. I put my hand on the brass handle. The metal was cold and solid. You have a week before the bank takes the house, I said, not looking back. I suggest you start packing. I opened the door and stepped out. Lillian, my mother's scream followed me high and shrill, echoing off the mahogany walls. I closed the door. Click. The heavy latch slid into place, cutting off the sound of their screaming. I stood in the hallway for a moment. It was quiet. The only sound was the muffled, distant noise of their rage behind the door and the steady beating of my own heart. I didn't feel guilty. That was the surprise. I expected to feel terrible. But as I walked down the hall, the sound of my heels clicking on the floor sounded like a drumbeat. It sounded like freedom. Sometimes the hardest person to stand up to isn't a bully on the playground. It's the people who share your last name. But just because you share blood doesn't mean you have to bleed for them. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. 2 weeks. That's how long it takes for a life to completely turn upside down. Or in my case, right side up. I sat at my kitchen table. It was the same scratched wooden table I'd had since college, but the papers sitting on top of it were different. They weren't overdue heating bills or threatening letters from student loan officers. They were bank statements, investment summaries, a deed to the commercial building on 4th Street, $5 million. I traced the numbers with my finger. It didn't feel real. It felt like Monopoly money. But the silence in my apartment, that felt real. For the first time in 10 years, there was no hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. You know that sound, that low frequency buzz that tells you something is about to go wrong. Something is going to bounce. Someone is going to call, asking for money you don't have. It was gone. The silence was absolute, and it was beautiful. I sipped my coffee. I had a choice to make. I had spent the last 14 days ignoring my phone. My parents had called 47 times. They had left voicemails that ranged from screaming rage to sobbing apologies to pathetic begging. The bank had taken the house on Elm Street 3 days ago. The locks were changed. The BMWs were repossessed. My parents were currently staying at the Motel 6 off the interstate. I could leave them there. God knows they deserved it. They would have left me there. If the roles were reversed, if they had the millions and I was the one drowning, they would have tossed me an anchor, not a life preserver. I could let them sink. It would be justice. It would be fair. But then I thought about Grandma Elise. I thought about the tea in the sunroom. I thought about her hands, gentle, kind, forgiving. She didn't cut them out of the will to destroy them. She did it to save them from themselves. If I destroyed them now, if I let them starve, would I still be her granddaughter? Or would I just be another version of them? I picked up the manila envelope sitting next to my coffee cup. It was heavy. I stood up. I grabbed my coat. I chose mercy, but not the kind of mercy they were expecting. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral ground. I arrived first. I watched them walk in through the glass window. It was shocking to see how quickly the facade crumbles when the money runs out. My father, Robert, wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a windbreaker and slacks that hadn't been pressed. He looked smaller, deflated like a balloon that had been left in the corner for too long. My mother, Sylvia, wore large sunglasses, presumably to hide her eyes, but she couldn't hide the fact that her roots were showing and her hands were shaking. They saw me. They didn't rush over. They walked slowly, almost hesitantly. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrified meekness. They sat down. They didn't order anything. They couldn't afford to. "Lillian," my father said. His voice was hoarse. "Thank you for coming." "Dad?" I nodded. "Mom." Sylvia just looked at the table. She seemed unable to meet my eyes. "We," Robert started, then cleared his throat. "We are in a difficult spot, Lillian. The motel, it's not suitable. Your mother isn't well." "I know," I said. "We were hoping," he continued, gaining a little steam, "that you had reconsidered. We don't need the control. We understand that now. But perhaps a loan, just to get us back on our feet, a down payment on a house, something." I looked at them. I looked for the monsters I had been afraid of my whole life. I didn't see them. I just saw two aging, incompetent people who had never learned how to survive in the real world. I didn't say a word. I just slid the manila envelope across the table. Robert stared at it. His eyes lit up. He thought it was a check. He thought I had caved. He thought I was the same soft pushover daughter I had always been. He grabbed the envelope and ripped it open. He pulled out the documents. His smile froze. "What is this?" he asked. "It's a deed," I said. "I see that," he said, flipping through the pages. "But this address, Willow Creek, that's on the south side. It's a 2-bedroom condo," I said, or calmly. "It's clean. It's safe. It has a small balcony." "A condo," Sylvia spoke up, her voice trembling. "In Willow Creek, but Lillian, that's where the factory workers live." "It's where people live," I corrected. "I bought it this morning, paid in full, $250,000. I pointed to the second document. "And that is a receipt. I have paid the condo fees and the property taxes for the next 5 years, $40,000. Robert looked at the paper, then at me. "I don't understand. Where is the cash? We have debts, Lillian. The credit cards." "The credit cards are your problem," I said. The table went silent. "Excuse me," Robert whispered. "I have given you a roof," I said. "You will never be homeless. You have a place to sleep. You have heat. You have water. That is more than most people get." I leaned in. "But I am not giving you a single penny of cash." "But how will we eat?" Sylvia cried. "How will we put gas in the car?" "You don't have a car anymore," I reminded her. "The bus stops right outside the complex." "And food?" Robert asked, his voice rising in panic. "Utilities, phone bills, work," I said. My father looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "Work?" "Yes," I said. "Work? You're 60 years old, Dad. You're healthy. I hear the grocery store down the street from the condo is hiring baggers. They pay $15 an hour." "Baggers," he sputtered. "I am a businessman." "You were a businessman," I said. "And you went out of business." I stood up. I felt 10 feet tall. "Lillian, you can't be serious," my mother pleaded. "You have $5 million. You could give us $1 million and not even miss it." "I could," I agreed. "And you would spend it in a year and we would be right back at this table." Grandma knew that, and now I know it. I buttoned my coat. "This is mercy, Dad," I said softly. "Mercy isn't giving you what you want. It's giving you what you need. You need a home. You have one. The rest is up to you." "Lillian," he called out as I turned away. "Don't walk away, Lillian." I didn't stop. I walked out of the coffee shop and into the cool afternoon air. I put my headphones on. I scrolled through my playlist until I found a song that felt like sunshine. I pressed play. The music swelled, drowning out the memory of their voices. I walked down the street, my steps light. I thought about the condo. It was a nice place, better than my first apartment. If they swallowed their pride, they could be happy there. If they got jobs, if they learned the value of $1, they could build a life that was actually real. But that was their choice, not mine. My choice was already made. I stopped at a crosswalk and looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, aching blue. Grandma Elise was right. Money doesn't buy happiness, but it buys dignity. It buys safety. And most importantly, it buys the ability to say no. I had saved them from the street, but I had also saved myself from them. As the light turned green, I stepped forward into the rest of my life. I had a job to do on Monday. I had clients who needed me. I had a future to build. And for the first time in my life, I went home and slept without worrying about the cost of tomorrow. We often confuse enabling with love. We think that if we just give a little more, endure a little more, people will change. But sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people carry their own weight. I hope Lillian's story reminded you that your dignity has a price tag, and it's not for sale. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember, true wealth is the peace of mind to sleep soundly at night. That brings Lillian's journey to a close. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family to protect your own peace? Don't be shy to share your thoughts below. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.